This world's present social order, what passes currently for civilization is progressively degenerating, being immersed in sin. This current civilization and most of its leaders stand in opposition to God and biblical truth. Such a situation, of course, is nothing new to God's people. Throughout all time, we've had to live and learn how to appropriately resist the spiritually alluring embrace of this world's zeitgeist. Zeitgeist, that invisible agent or force dominating the characteristics of any particular given epoch in world history. I want you to turn with me in the New Covenant Scriptures, turn with me to Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 1. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 1. Now, the Apostle Paul was writing the Ephesians, he's writing to people who lived a Greek Hellenistic culture. They were living according to the zeitgeist. They grew up according to the zeitgeist of their culture and their time, their civilization. So, Paul said this to the Ephesians. He wrote, "To you who were spiritually dead, all the time that you drifted along on the stream of this world's ideas of living and obeyed its unseen ruler, who is still operating in those who do not respond to the truth of God. To you, Christ has given life. We all lived like that in the past and followed the impulses and imaginations of our evil nature, being in fact under the wrath of God by nature like everyone else. But even though we were dead in our sins, God, who is rich in mercy and because of the great love he had for us, gave us life together with Christ, the Jewish Messiah, who was crucified and raised in newness of life that we might have life. It is, remember, by grace and not by achievement that you are saved, and has lifted us right out of the old life to take our place with him in Christ in the heavens. Thus he shows for all time the tremendous generosity of the grace and kindness he has expressed towards us in Jesus Christ. It was nothing you could or did achieve. It was God's gift to you. No one can pride himself upon earning the love of God. The fact is that what we are, we owe to the hand of God upon us. We are born afresh in Christ and born to those good deeds which God planned for us to do. And one of those good deeds that God plans for us to do is to, resist the alluring embrace of this world's zeitgeist, to resist that invisible agent or force that is dominating the characteristics of our age right now. It's not enough just to love God and say, we must make right choices. We must do right things. If we go to Matthew 7 and verse 13, Christ said this. He explained this to all of his disciples, and he said in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 13, New Living Translation, he said, you, that is God's people, you can enter God's kingdom only through the narrow gate. That is the way that's not popular, the way that is not according to the zeitgeist of our time. Because he says the highway to destruction, or in some, if you look at the old King James, perdition, the highway to destruction is broad and easy, and its gate is wide for the many who choose that way. Yeah, it's easy to go with the flow. It's easy to go with the flow, Some employer, some state mandates you to do something. It's always easier just to go with the flow. But the gateway to life is very narrow, and the road is difficult, and only a few ever find it. And that is a difficult teaching. That is a difficult teaching. And Jesus responding to this, Lord, are there only a few who are saved? And Jesus would say, well, pay attention, make sure you are one of those. And he's saying very clearly that the gateway to life is very narrow and the road is difficult and only a few ever find it. That's a sobering thought. Because most people just flowing around with the course of this world, they're going along with the stream of this world's ideas of living. They're going along with the zeitgeist. They're not going to find the narrow gate, or as the King James said, the straight gate, the one that's narrow. In the old city walls, oftentimes you had a broad gate that you would enter in, but they oftentimes had put in the wall little narrow gates because they wanted to have people sometimes slip in and out or wanted to control it more closely. But that was, there was just one person wide. It wasn't, where you could line up a group of people and go through. Let's go to Revelation chapter 18. Revelation chapter 18. I'm going to stay with the New Living Translation for a moment. Revelation chapter 18 and verse 1. After all this, breaking into the middle of this revelation the Apostle John was given, after all this I saw another angel come down from heaven with great authority, and the earth grew bright with his splendor. And he gave a mighty shout, Babylon is fallen, the great city is fallen. Babylon, that's, it's a symbol for all this world's civilization and coming together. You think of ancient, but all the different ethnic groups and peoples coming together. It was the global village on steroids. Babylon is fallen. The great city is fallen. She has become a home for demons. She is a hideout for every unclean spirit, a hideout for every foul vulture and every unclean and dreadful animal. For all the nations have fallen because of the wine of her passionate immorality. All of them have been corrupted. All of them have turned into gross immorality because of the zeitgeist that Babylon had been able to extend over the entire world. Remember, this is prophetic. The kings of the world have committed adultery with her because of her desires, passionate desires for extravagant luxury. Yes, we want to be really prosperous. We want to push that stock market to the heavens high. And the merchants of the world have grown rich. Then I heard another voice calling from heaven, Come away from her, my people. Do not take part in her sins, or you will be punished with her. For her sins are piled as high as heaven, and God remembers her evil deeds. It's very important. We do not get caught up in the zeitgeist of our time. We have to be having our nose in the scriptures to reflect upon these things and reflect upon how we're living our lives, how we're dealing with the challenges we face in this society. Because this is not a godly society. As I said, the leaders of our time have turned their backs on the Bible's God, on his values, on the teachings that Jesus Christ gave us. They're doing just the opposite so often these days. Proverbs 8:13 makes this point, that if we're going to say we're Christians, if we're going to say we're God's people, it's more than, we have to do more than just say, well, I love God, I love my neighbor. There's more to it than just that. There's more to it than just that. It's just not your personal feelings. I have this emotion. That's not enough. Proverbs 8:13 makes this point, and I'm going to read this in the Amplified. The reverent fear and worshipful awe of the Lord includes the hatred of evil, pride, arrogance, the evil way, and perverted and twisted speech I hate. We must be willing to hate what the Lord hates. That is, if we're going to have an appropriate fear and love of God, to love him with all our hearts, we have to also detest what is wrong, what is evil. And that's not going to make our life always easy. And then Proverbs 24 puts it this way, Proverbs 24:10. I'll cite this one, the International Children's Bible. I like it because it's just straightforward from that way. If you give up when trouble comes, it shows you have very little strength. living in this world for God's people is going to be trouble, because we're not going to flow along with the stream of the zeitgeist of this time. We must stand up and resist it. We must recognize, and we've got to hate what is wrong and what is evil, as much as we love what is good and what is right. In their time, the 2nd century BC, the Maccabees were also called upon to resist the alluring embrace of this world's zeitgeist, that invisible force or agent that then dominated the age. I want you to, this week, I thought it was very interesting. I picked up this little bit of news from the Jerusalem Post on November 28th this year. It was in the archaeological section. That's why I like to look at the Jerusalem Post, because they actually have a tab, archaeology. Hey, all right. How many newspapers do you have that have a section they keep track? But this is, of course, the land of Israel, and they have lots of archaeology. And I think when my brother was going to Hebrew University and studying archaeology, it was almost like one of the national undeclared sports was archaeology. Everybody's interested in it, as much as you might be baseball or something like this. Anyways, from the Jerusalem Post, November 28th, Dateline, a lead projectile dating back to the times of the Maccabees was discovered by the Civil Administration's Archaeological Department on Sunday. The 3-centimeter projectile, 3 centimeters, okay, that's metric. For you Americans, that means a little over an inch. So it's a fairly decent size. It is a projectile, for a sling. You'd go it around and a piece of lead like that, you send it very fast. Deadly is all get out, and because they're making them lead, because rather than stones, because you get a uniform. It's very heavy, it's very dense, this matter, but it's also uniform, so you can get very accurate with that. And so by this time, anyways, a lead projectile dating back to the time of the Maccabees was discovered by the Civil Administration's Archaeological Department. The 3-centimeter projectile carries the name. In other words, when they put it in the molds, because they made them in molds, they had the name. They were sophisticated enough, and they wanted to attribute all these things to Diosdotus Tryphon, a Hellenist Seleucid king who reigned over the Seleucid Empire from 142 to 138 BC. A symbol representing Zeus, the ancient Greek religion's king of the gods, is also etched onto the projectile. So we're going to smite you, and we're going to have the name of the king and the name of the king's god, Zeus. The projectile was discovered at Ziph, an archaeological site in the South Hebron Hills. Tryphon is known for the assassination of Jonathan in 143 BC, one of Antiochus' sons. Judah Maccabees' successor as leader of the Maccabees, and he was also high priest of Judea. Jonathan was the younger brother of Judah Maccabee, Dad initiated. Mattathias, Judah's father, started it. But anyways, but Judah took over the leadership in the fight against the Seleucid Empire, and he was the leader from 167 to 160 BC. After Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid king, had issued decrees compelling the Jews living in Judea and the Galilee region to abandon their traditional worship of the Hebrew God of the Bible and to embrace instead Hellenism, which at that time, the zeitgeist of the time, it was a progressive globalist culture with its prosperity that it offered due to its technological innovations, effective political institutions, attractive aesthetics, those nice, pretty Greek statues of naked guys and women. Fascinating philosophy, its flexible, inclusive approach to religious belief, they could adapt any sort of local gods into their system. They really didn't care, as long as you also, as long as you had a spot in there and you'd recognize the king as a god too, because all of the Hellenistic kings of the different groups, they were worshipped as gods. They liked to have, because they liked that position, except for the ones that's interesting in Greece. After the death of Alexander the Great, when they divided up his empire, the section that went to Greece, they couldn't quite pull that off to the Greeks themselves. I'm a god. They said, no, you're not. The Greeks wouldn't put up. But for the Middle Easterners and the Egyptians, yeah, they could get away with it. Hellenism had come onto the world stage, of course, due to a dramatic political transformation that was prophesied long before by Daniel, the prophet Daniel. Let's go to Daniel chapter 8 and verse 1. Daniel chapter 8 and verse 1. Of course, this is one of the prophecies of Daniel are one of the proofs of the Bibles that God was revealing things ahead of time. Of course, there are oftentimes, scholars, historians look at these scriptures and they say, well, it couldn't have been written hundreds of years earlier. It had to be written after these events took place because it's too accurate. Well, see, these people don't have faith. Daniel was written at the time by Daniel, and he lived generations earlier than the events he described. Daniel chapter 8 and verse 1, I'm going to read this. What brought Hellenism onto the world stage? What was the zeitgeist of the time? The third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, the second vision, which is, we're talking about the Neo-Babylonian Empire, at this point in time in the late 500s BC. So we're dealing with more than 300 years earlier when this prophecy was given. A vision appeared to me, Daniel. This was 2 years after the first vision appeared to me. And I looked in the vision, and it seemed that I was at the citadel of Susa, the capital of Persia, which is in the province of Elam. And I looked in the vision, and I saw myself by the Ulai Canal. Then I raised my eyes and looked, and behold, there was in front of the canal stood one lone ram, which was the Medo-Persian Empire in symbol, which had two horns, Medo-Persia. The two horns were high, but one, Persia, was higher than the other, Media. So, this is symbolism in the vision. And the higher one came up last. And I saw the ram, the Medo-Persian Empire, charging westward and northward and southward, and no beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone who could rescue anything from his power, but he did as he pleased and magnified himself. So the Medo-Persian Empire did expanded all the way to the west. It expanded all the way into Greece. Remember that whole thing of the Thermopylae and the 300 and all those things under Xerxes when he was doing this, and down into Egypt. And it took, of course, all of the promised land. Because it was during the time of the Medo-Persian Empire that, of course, you had people like Ezra and Nehemiah go back and you had the return and the restoration of the temple and the reconstruction of the wall around Jerusalem. All these things in the scripture was during the Medo-Persian Empire, that part of it. Verse 5, as I was observing this, a male goat, which is going to represent force coming from Greece, was coming from the west, rushing across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. In other words, they were fast. And the Greeks were fast because they had cavalry. And they got around, they learned how to do things quickly. And the goat had a conspicuous and remarkable horn. This great horn, Alexander the Great, between his eyes, and he came up to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and charged at him in the fury of his power and wrath. And in my vision I saw him come close to the ram, the Medo-Persian Empire representative symbol, and he was filled with rage toward him. Because remember, under Xerxes and the Persians, they had tried to invade and conquer and take over Greece earlier, at this point in time. And the goat Greece struck the ram and shattered his two horns, and the ram had no strength to stand before him. So the goat threw him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. See, this is where you had the complete destruction of the power of the Medo-Persian Empire. This is one of the reasons why, they burnt Persepolis. You have this magnificent ruin. If I could go to Iran, I'd love to go to Iran to visit it. I'm just not sure the Ayatollahs would let me leave if I went to Iran. Of course, these days, I'm not even sure I could leave my own country, Canada, because the government has all their restrictions. We no longer have the freedom of mobility. That's a different story, isn't it? Then the male goat, that is the Greeks, Alexander the Great and his army, magnified himself exceedingly, and when he was young and strong, the great horn, Alexander, was suddenly broken. See, Alexander died very young, and in his place there came up 4 prominent horns. See, he had a child, but the child didn't survive, probably. They poisoned it, or whatever it might have been. So 4 prominent horns came up in place of Alexander, among whom the kingdom was divided, one toward each of the 4 winds of heaven. And that's, historically totally accurate. This is what happened. Is the kingdom broke up into 4 of Alexander's generals took different parts. 2 of the main parts we're talking about is we have the Seleucids and we have the Ptolemies. And the Seleucids are named after the first one of the Greek generals who was Seleucid, and Ptolemy was down in Greece. In Egypt, excuse me. Sorry about that. So verse 9. Out of one of them, that is going to be the Seleucids' horn, Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes came forth a rather small horn, but one of irreverent presumption and profane pride, which grew exceedingly powerful towards the south and towards the east and towards the beautiful land, meaning Israel. And of course, during his reign, 175, I think it was, to 160 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes had several campaigns in which he was trying to take over Egypt. But the Romans eventually, in the second one, because he was being successful, came and said, Rome doesn't favor this, and you're going to be in big trouble if you keep on doing it. And Antiochus Epiphanes had to back off because the Romans had beaten his father previously, and a decade earlier. I think it was 190 BC, and had forced them to pay an indemnity. They had to pay a tax to the Romans. The Romans were stronger than the Seleucid Empire at that time, so he had to back off. But anyways, he also had, and finally when he would die, I believe Antiochus Epiphanes died in Babylon. He died in the east because he was trying to extend his power. Verse 10, and in my vision, this little horn, grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the hosts and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them. Indeed, it magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host of heaven, and took away from him the daily sacrifice, the burnt offering, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. It was profaned. Because of why was this allowed? Why did God allow his temple to be defiled by this little horn symbolically representing? And most people who look at the scriptures understand this little horn was Antiochus Epiphanes. It says here, it explains very clearly here in verse 12, because of the transgression. See, the transgression of God's people, because of most of their leaders, they were irreverent, they were ungodly, they were doing things that wrong. They were playing politics with Antiochus Epiphanes and trying to buy the office of the high priesthood, trying to adopt the culture, get it in tune with the zeitgeist of that time. Because of the transgression of God's people. The host will be given over to the wicked horn along with the regular sacrifice, and righteousness and truth will be flung to the ground, and the horn will do as it pleases. Because God's going to take his hands off. He's going to say, oh, all right, they're sinning. My people, their leadership, they're sinning. They've turned their backs on me, so they're not doing what I've told them to do. So I'm not gonna protect them. See, it's just like right now, our leaders have turned their backs on God. God's not going to protect us. He's going to intervene to pull our chestnuts out of the fire. The horn will do as it pleases and prosper. In other words, it'll get its way. Then I heard a holy one. That is an angel speaking. This is Daniel in vision, remember. And another holy one said to the one who was speaking, how much time will be required to complete the vision regarding the regular sacrifice, the transgression that brings abomination? This is the abomination of desolation is in the New King James Version or the King James Version or many something like that. That brings horror, and the trampling underfoot of both the sanctuary and the host, that is, of the people. How long is this oppression going to take place? And he told me for 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary will be cleansed and properly restored. Yes, the Maccabees would resist. They would be forced into resistance, and the temple eventually would be cleansed. I want to read a little something here from the book Harvest of Hellenism. And it says that antiquity knew little of what to make of Antiochus IV. He would be vilified by the Jewish nation, but his fellow Greek contemporaries were somewhat more ambivalent. For them, Antiochus IV had a theatrical and erratic temperament, and yet they judged that he was a serious and determined man. What appeared ominous to the Jews of that time alternately dazzled and puzzled the city of Antiochus' 2nd century BC Seleucid Empire, which included at that point in time parts of Turkey, even Saudi Arabia, all of Syria, most of Iraq. At times, Antiochus IV would rush about his capital city of Antioch, which is modern-day Antakya in Turkey right now, if you were looking on a map, acting as though he was a Roman candidate for office, canvassing votes, looking for a municipal vote. But underneath the populist exterior touch, his public image that he represented, Antiochus was a sort of narcissist who thought the world revolved around him, and he would never hesitate to abuse anyone who got in his way. Be like a prime minister who didn't like a cabinet minister telling him, no, we can't give this major corporation a break, from the laws, something like that. They've been bribing these other people. We should prosecute them and take them to court. No, you want to do that? The votes are not there. So they get rid of Antiochus was like contemporary figures. He was a narcissist. And if you got in his way, he would push. He would eliminate you one way or the other. And Antiochus, being an absolute ruler, he didn't have to play nice at all. Nothing was, off the books. Nothing, was out of his reach, I should say. So Antiochus was a ruler who inscribed his own silver and gold coins that he minted with the legend, Theos Epiphanes, the God made manifest. And those coins carried the standard symbols associated with the ruler of the Greek pantheon of gods, Zeus, and a little, lightning bolt type of things that they used to do. The facial features on these coins just, they had this striking resemblance they bore to Antiochus himself. So he was just following in the Hellenistic practice of saying, I'm the God made manifest, the Theos Epiphanes. There were more, he wasn't the only one among the Hellenistic rulers of the ancient Middle East who did that. There was another one who did that too. They all had big heads. Antiochus Epiphanes was a strong proponent of Hellenism, the globalism of his day. Prosperity in the Near East and that whole particular area that we call the Middle East maybe today, that time was Hellenic urban prosperity. But that Greek form of prosperity was mostly, the ones who benefited mostly was the top 1%, the elite. Does that sound surprising? We have the same thing now. See, the stock market has, gone up amazingly in the last 10 years. Who has it benefited? Mostly the elite, because they're the ones who own all the stocks. They're buying up all the land. The corporations are buying up even houses to rent to people now these days, even single-family houses. Prosperity was primarily set up to benefit the ruling elite, while gradually dispossessing everybody else. But they were able to, and when it came to the land of Judea, Jerusalem and all that area, they were able to do that because, of course, they had a core of Hellenistic Jews who wanted to get in with the zeitgeist of their time. They thought, compromising and going into this was the modern way of doing this. This is how you got ahead. So they were able to go in there, and because of the corruption of the leadership, they started buying the office of the high priest, saying, I can pay more for it because, Antiochus always, like every government, they want money. They need more taxes. And you had a number of people who wanted the positions of power among the people, among God's people, and they went up and said, I can make you a better deal. I'll give you more money if you give me some benefits. And they promised that if you put me in the office of high priest, and he did that. One of them, finally, Jason, who was Joshua, but his Greek version of his name was Jason, he managed to even buy the privilege of reorganizing the temple state of Jerusalem or Judea. Instead of having a council elders, they would have a municipal senate, and the people who would run it, they were going to follow all the Hellenistic political organization, and they were also meant that they were going to bring in and work at culturally assimilating many of the people with the ideas of this globalism of Hellenism of that time. Antiochus Epiphanes expected the aristocratic class there in Jerusalem, of the top leaders, to mold the youth under their authority so they'd better reflect the ideal of the Greek version of political correctness of that time, to produce those citizen warriors who would promote the vision that he had of Hellenism, of the Greek civic culture. And it was carried out. They had all their institutions, the gymnasium, which was just not a place of working out. Yeah, it was there, but they also taught philosophy and other values that brought in the culture. These values, however, many of them, maybe most of them, were in direct conflict with the values taught by God's word, the scriptures. This is not what the scriptures were teaching them. Eventually, the land of those Jews, all in the surrounding area, all their possessions, their land, if they wouldn't be culturally assimilated, it would eventually be confiscated and redistributed to the king's supporters. They did take away the land, and they said, okay, if you're going to come down here, they brought in Syrians who as soldiers, and they gave them certain land as this is the way that they used to do it in Hellenism. They would want to settle the area, they would give it to the people, said, okay, we'll give you a stake in this, you fight for us, and you support this, and we'll give you the land of these other people. And of course, those Syrian soldiers brought their gods with them, and those things ended up on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Biblically loyal Jews would find themselves forced to resist this Hellenistic cultural, religious, economic challenge that they were being pushed into. And it was a mixture of things. It was a political challenge, it was a cultural challenge, it was a religious challenge, it was an economic challenge that the regime presented to them. As a result of what Antiochus Epiphanes saw, because people didn't like it and they resisted it, he saw this as impudence. He saw this, he took it as an insult to him because of who he was. He was a God made manifest. How dare they resist him, these farmers, these people, whatever. So he decided that he wasn't going to try to persuade them or reform the Jews. He would rather punish them. He would punish them. He made the observance of the Sabbath illegal. He ordered the destruction of, burning of any copies of the Hebrew Bible or the scrolls that he could find, and he made it illegal to possess it. If they found a copy of the Bible with you, they'd kill you and your family. Of course, they forbid the sign of circumcision, that commitment to the God's covenant. And then they also would coerce you to participate in their culture. In that case, sacrificing a pig, an unclean animal according to the scriptures, on an altar to Zeus. They would force you to celebrate the king's birthday because he was a god after all, and so you had to celebrate and join in civic festivals and participations, because they used to have these big parades in honor of Dionysus, and everybody would run around and you had to participate in the life of the community, something that you couldn't do if you were going to be faithful to God. In short, Antiochus sought to abrogate the Mosaic law, scriptural teachings, and he all in an effort to try to abrogate, to eliminate any cultural distinctiveness of God's people that made them separate from the worldly people of the time. He wanted to eliminate the covenant that God had with his people. Consequently, Antiochus Epiphanes, as I said, he wouldn't allow you to keep the Sabbath. He was going to make people, work. He sent out his agents to round up collections of the scriptures, to burn them. And if they found a woman or a family was circumcising their baby boys, he'd kill the babies and kill the family. And making them sacrifice to Zeus. What were you going to do? They were compelling, they were mandating everything that was destroying your biblical identity as a believer. It's interesting, the religion. They define it. Hellenism was in practice primarily centered around a polytheistic and animistic worship. Devotees worshiped the Greek gods, Antiochus Epiphanes liked Zeus. He also liked Diana. And the spirits of nature, they called them nymphs sometimes, and underworld deities and heroes, Hercules, Both physical and spiritual ancestors were greatly honored. This was the type of religion that it was. Daniel talked about that. Talked about Antiochus Epiphanes in the prophecy. Daniel, let's go to Daniel chapter 11 and verse 21. I'm going to read this in the Amplified Bible version. Daniel 11, verse 21. And in his place, that is a ruler's place in the Seleucid Empire, will arise a despicable and despised person to whom the royal majesty and the honor of kingship have not been conferred. Actually, this previous guy was assassinated, and so Antiochus was able to fill the shoes. But he will come in without warning in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue, which he did. It's a palace coup, if you would. Verse 22. And then it goes, verse 22, segues into a later act of Antiochus' reign. The overwhelming forces of the invading armies of Egypt will be flooded away before him and smashed, and also the prince of the covenant will be smashed. That's what Daniel prophesied. And of course, that's what would happen. The existing high priest at that time when Antiochus Epiphanes came into power was Ananias III. He was a high priest. He was a Zadokite priest. But he got involved in politics. And he had gone because, as it would, when you had opposing sides, they were each whispering to the king, this guy is for you, this guy is not, I can make you a better deal. They got into playing in all of this politics. And it cost the lives of Ananias. Actually, it cost the lives of three main figures that were there who became high priests, Ananias and Jason, and then Menelaus. They all would eventually meet their demise for being involved in playing these politics. Verse 23. After an alliance is made with them, because they did, the high priestly family, first it was Jason and then it was Menelaus. They made a deal, with Antiochus Epiphanes. He will work deceitfully, and he will go up and gain power with a small people. Then he, the Antiochus, will return to his land with great treasure and plunder, and he will set his heart against the Holy Covenant. And he will take action and return to his own land, up to Antioch, which is, up there in Turkey. At that time, appointed by God, he will return and come into the south towards the promised land and towards Egypt. But this time he will not be successful, as were the previous invasions of Egypt, because this was his second invasion. Between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies in Egypt, there were about 5 wars that took place over the period of time, and 2 of them were Antiochus Epiphanes wars. For then ships of, verse 3, it was prophecy of Daniel, for ships of Cyprus that were in Roman hands will come against them, therefore you'll be discouraged. They'll have to turn back, you have to turn, the Romans wouldn't let them take over Egypt. He said, we're not going to let you take over the Ptolemaic kingdom. You could be too strong, so they forced him out. And he took out, and he came back, and he was angry, and it says to carry out his rage. He was discouraged and turned back and carry out his rage against the Holy Covenant, take action, so he will return and show favoritism towards those Jews who abandon, who break the Holy Covenant with God. Verse 31, armed forces of his will rise in Jerusalem and defile and desecrate the sanctuary, the spiritual stronghold, and will do away with the regular sacrifice, that is the daily burnt offering, and he will set up a pagan altar in the sanctuary, which is the abomination of desolation, with smooth words of flattery and praise. Politicians are very good with flattery and praise. He will turn to godlessness those who are willing to disregard the covenant, God's covenant. But the people who are spiritually mature and know their God will display strength and take action to resist. Because it came a point in time that they would either resist or they'd have to surrender all their values, turn their back on it. Sometimes you're forced into a situation where there's one choice or the other. Which are you going to choose? Verse 33. They who are wise and have spiritual insight among the people will instruct many and help them understand. Yet for many days some of them and their followers will fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder. And when they fall, they will receive a little help. But many will join them in hypocrisy. And this was the story of the Maccabees. When they started to revolt, when they were being forced to either, they had the choice. Either they're going to sacrifice a pig on a pagan altar to Zeus, or they were going to resist. There was no, either you do it or you fight. And they chose to fight. But they had to leave their homes. They had to go up in the hills. They had to go out in the, as a wilderness. They had to be vagabonds. It was tough. It was a narrow gate. It was a hard path. Some joined them. But as I said, some would join them with hypocrisy. They would only do it for advantage, especially after they started to have some success. In verse 35, then this vision goes on, some of those who are spiritually wise and have insight will fall as martyrs in order to refine, to purge, and to make those among God's people pure until the end time, because it is yet to come at the time appointed by God. God has, sometimes he puts us through a refining process. This is sometimes a difficult thing. I'm sure, the Maccabees didn't, Antiochus, who was an older man in his 80s, and his sons, high priests, they didn't necessarily, this was not what they wanted in their life when they, earlier. But things changed. And it happened actually in a relatively short period of time, over a period of some 30 years. Things began at 33 years. Things changed over that period of time. In verse 36, Daniel 11:36, then the king, the Antichrist, as it were, will do exactly as it pleases. He will exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and will speak astounding and disgusting things against the God of gods. And he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is determined by God will be done. In many ways, the Jews living around Jerusalem and in Judea in 167 BC were facing the same challenges that the later church of Thyatira would face. Thyatira is an area, it's a city in antiquity in the area of modern day, what we call modern day Turkey. It was established as a Hellenistic city by the Seleucids earlier. The culture of Hellenism, when the book of Revelation was written, that was the culture of the time. That was the culture of the time. And the fascinating thing is when you look at it, the Seleucids started this Hellenization of the Middle East and of the land of Israel and Galilee and all these things. The Romans came in and they just put in extra money and they continued the process. See, there wasn't a big break in culture or activity or whatever, the approach of the two. The Romans were following essentially the playbook set up by the Seleucids. And the story that began with the Maccabees, 167, when they openly went to war with them, would finally be finished by the Romans in 73 AD, when they extinguished the last resistance of Masada. 3 years earlier, they destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the temple. And then you know what they did. They re-erected, and made it, a temple to Zeus, to Jupiter Olympus. And then when they made it just a city where they excluded all the Jews. So you had that whole period of time that was going on. And the church found itself during this period of time, they were scattered. It was no longer, after the period of time of Hadrian, whatever, the church wasn't based anymore in Jerusalem. When the apostle John was given this prophecy and he wrote it down, he was in exile. He was up in Patmos in this area. In this church, if we go to Revelation chapter 2 and verse 18, I'm going to read this revelation that was given to Apostle John, because it's interesting, because it has similarities. I'm thinking, anyways, the New Living Translation says, verse 18, Revelation 2, write this letter to the angel of the church of Thyatira. This is the message from the Son of God, whose eyes are like the flames of fire and whose feet are like polished bronze. I know the things you do. I've seen your love, your faith, your service, and your patient endurance. And I can see your constant improvement in all these things, but I have this complaint against you. You are permitting that woman, that Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet, to lead my servants astray. She teaches them to commit sexual sin and to eat food offered to idols. That was, the Jews of the Maccabees time, they had that, Hellenism, there's a great deal of sexual sin involved, temple prostitution and all that, eating food offered to idols, good pork roast, offered, on the altar of Zeus. That's what they were faced with. Verse 21, I gave her time to repent, but she didn't want to turn away from her immorality. Therefore, I will throw her on a bed of suffering, and those who commit adultery with her will suffer greatly unless they repent and turn away from their evil deeds. God is saying you can't compromise with that sort of thing. You can't compromise with the zeitgeist of the time when you have this choice. Which way are you going to go? Is it the narrow gate, or is it going to be the broad and easy one? Which way, what is your choice that you're going to make? Verse 23, I will strike her children dead. Then all the churches will know that I am the one who searches out the thoughts and intentions of every person, and I will give to each of you whatever you deserve. Verse 24, but I also have a message for the rest of you in Thyatira who have not followed this false teaching. And it is interesting here in the Living Version. Deeper truths, as they call them. Depths of Satan, actually. I will ask nothing more of you, except that you hold tightly to what you have until I come, to all who are victorious. To all who are victorious, to all, in the Greek word is nikao, who conquer, who overcome, who carry off their victory, who come off victorious, like the Maccabees had to do. Who obey me to the very end, to them I will give authority over the nations. See, that's the promise. It's a promise to the church, but we must overcome, we must conquer, we must be victorious. The weapons of our warfare, of course, are not carnal. We're not picking up swords or hammers like Judah the hammer, or spears, or these arrows, or slings, or this sort of thing. It says, to all those who are victorious, who obey me to the end, to them I will give authority over the nations. And they will rule the nations with an iron rod and smash them like clay pots. See, the promises in the future of, it'll be turned on its way. It's no longer going to be the zeitgeist is God's people are always, on the losing end of it. There will come a time when it will be reversed. They will have the same authority I received from my Father, and I will also give them the morning star. Anyone who has ears to hear must listen to the Spirit and understand what is saying to the churches. We have responsibility not to just give in to the zeitgeist of our time when we have these questions of what is sin and what is not sin. We must not sin. We must not participate in those things. We must not be willing just to turn our backs on God and on the Scriptures because it becomes very inconvenient. There is a certain amount, we see the trend that's going on. The government here in Canada right now is getting ready to, they're trying very definitely for the people who have problems with a pregnancy, rather than getting abortion, they can get abortion counseling. There are those sites that are, I'm trying to think of what the word is. There are a number of these agencies that not only do they protest abortion clinics, but they provide alternative counseling, and they provide material help. And the government in Canada is thinking of stripping them of their charitable status, so they can no longer, there's not any financial help at all, but people giving donations. There's not any of the motivation. You give them money to do something, it's your after tax money. You don't get a deduction from it anymore. And there are a lot of people, because the government has tried, and previously in summer works programs, they said, well, we're not going to give this unless you can check the box and saying, I support abortion, and a woman's right to choose. And there are a lot of churches saying, well, if they're going to do this with these centers that provide abortion counseling and help to women and try to convince them not to have an abortion, if they're going to strip them of their charitable status, they can do that with churches or anybody else. They can, it is another element of oppression. Do you go along with it? Obviously, a lot of people are currently making efforts to oppose this. But the government has the votes because there are other parties that will support them, even if they're a minority government. Do you go along with the zeitgeist of your time? Hopefully the people who are running some of these agencies, these counseling agencies, won't give up. And the people who support them will continue to support them, even if it costs additional money, because you're going to have to use after-tax dollars. Scriptures say very clearly that we're coming into a time of increased pressure, stress upon God's people. We can't just, collapse and go along with the zeitgeist of our time that Satan is inspiring. Because we see the handwriting on the wall, the coercion, the compelling speech, and all the other things that are going on. It's there, it's clear. We have to think about these things in advance. We'll close here with a prophecy that came also at Daniel chapter 12. After all these things he's talking about what they needed to do, he has some encouraging words to us in this time who are facing this sort of zeitgeist, these similarities, because Jesus used, this whole point was that he said in John 10, this abomination of desolation in Matthew 24, he's linking the events that happened in so many of the zeitgeist of what happened during the time of Maccabees with the end times, which is why I've talked about, the difficulty in opposing a culture that is, very much anti-God. And until a point where, it moved from tolerance to, well, you can do your own thing, whatever, as long as you pay your taxes, to, no, you can't do your own thing. We're not going to let you do your own thing. You've got to do our thing, and that's all the way it is. Daniel 12 and verse 1, New Living Translation. At that time, Michael the archangel, who stands guard over your nation, will arise. Then there will be a time of anguish greater than any since nations first came into existence. But at that time, every one of your people whose names are written in the book of life, will be rescued. Many of those whose bodies lie dead and buried will rise up, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting disgrace, because they fell short. Verse 3. Those who are wise will shine as bright as the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness will shine like the stars forever. But you, Daniel, keep this prophecy a secret. Seal up the book until the time of the end, when many will rush here and there, and knowledge will increase. And I, Daniel, looked and saw two others standing on opposite banks of the river, and one of them asked the man dressed in linen, who is now standing above the river, how long will it be until these shocking events are over? The man dressed in linen, who was standing above the river, raised both his hands towards heaven and took a solemn oath by the one who lives forever, saying, it will go on for a time, times, and half a time. When the shattering of the holy people has finally come to an end, all these things will have happened. I heard what he said, but I did not understand what he meant. So I asked, how will all this finally end, my Lord? And he said, "Go now, Daniel. For what I have said is kept secret and sealed until the time of the end. Many will be purified, cleansed, and refined by these trials. But the wicked will continue in their wickedness, and none of them will understand. Only those who are wise will know what it means. From the time that the daily sacrifice is stopped, and the sacrilegious object that causes desecration is set up to be worshipped, there will be 1,290 days." Verse 12, "And blessed are those who wait and remain until the end of the 1,335 days, another 45 days, a month and a half. As for you, go your way until the end. You will rest, and then at the end of days you will rise again to receive the inheritance set aside for you." Brethren, during these days of Hanukkah, let us think about these things, the zeitgeist of our times. Let us think about, what our red lines are, as I've talked in other sermons, the things that we must not compromise on. And let us consider these things in advance while we have a chance. Let us do what we can and draw near to God and value what he has to say. Because obviously we are facing some difficult times ahead, as the prophecies indicate. But yet there is hope for us, and there are other promises, and we will inherit that authority to shatter, an evil civilization that wants to live in opposition to the ways of the living God.